For those who might have come here for the first time, I should like to remind you that yesterday I discussed the factors that created national consciousness in India and how in this process the work of social reformers directly or indirectly played its part, and secondly, and perhaps more importantly, the work of those who are called economic nationalists, the earliest body of nationalists in the modern sense, who um, who did considerable research into how England was exploiting India and how Indian poverty could be traced to this exploitation. In other words, it was not only the British fact of exploitation, but the lot of the Indian poor, which to which they drew particular attention. It's true that apart from this major concern, they also pointed out how the Indian middle class suffered from lack of employment, from discrimination in service, and from racism. This led to the foundation ultimately of the Indian National Congress in 1885, which started with very moderate demands, but demands which the British government could not concede, and therefore after only 2 years there began a consistent program against the Congress inaugurated by the British government. Faced by this as offensive, the nationalists tended to divide into two groups. One was the moderates, which still believed in petitions, constitutional reform, a kind of collaboration with the British government for what they believed to be the good of the Indian people. These were the moderates, or as they styled themselves, the old guard who had founded the Indian National Congress. On the other hand, there were the so-called extremists, or as they called themselves, militant nationalists, who believed that Swaraj, self-rule, should be the objective, and unlike the moderates, they did not believe that social reform should be pursued. They believed only that political agitation was the main thing, and they believed in mass mobilization, which could only come at that moment, at that time, through religious appeals, of which Tilak, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, was master. He appealed both to Hindu and Muslim sentiments, both on the issue of age of consent bill and on the issue of plague inoculation. But obviously, the Hindu appeal was stronger in Tilak's movement than any appeal to Muslim sentiments, although Tilak was fairly popular among Muslims in Maharashtra. Both these streams were disliked by the British government, obviously, and under Lord Curzon, with whom we shall start now. This reached its apex at that time, very much like Dufferin, who had started the offensive against the Congress in 1888. Curzon believed that the Congress, especially the moderates, had no mass influence. They were only critical of the British government, and he believed that the extremists too needed to be put down, and this could be done by first controlling educational institutions, and secondly by pursuing a divisive policy dividing Hindus and Muslims. These were his twin objectives. Although Curzon was reputed to be a good administrator, he aroused considerable dislike among educated Indians. Until 1921, perhaps Akbar Allahabadi is the index of this dislike, and I quoted him running down Lady Curzon in a verse when I closed yesterday. I will begin by quoting another verse, 1903, before the partition of Bengal, when the Darbar took place and Duke of Connaught came to India. And he says about his visit to Delhi, सबसे ऊंचे लाट को देखा, हजरत ड्यूक कनॉट को देखा, रंग ज़माना आज का देखा, रुख करजन महाराज का देखा. You know, Maharaj Curzon Maharaj is not an honorable as a creditable thing to assert it. When you say Maharaj, you are joking. So Ruh Curzon Maharaj ka dekha. So Curzon knew, of course, that he was not popular. He was believed to be very strong-armed, and as it happened, he was not even popular, very much popular with the British government, to whom, because he was very much his own man, disregarded Secretary of State's or for India's instructions from London, and it was on a very minor issue where he actually disregarded those instructions that he had to resign in 1905. But before he resigned, he carried out two important measures. One was the Indian Universities Act of 1904. There were many unexceptionable provisions in the 1904 Act. It provided the conversion of Indian universities from mere examining institutions into postgraduate teaching institutions. Calcutta, Madras and Bombay and Allahabad universities were the first four universities to which this applied. But there were other provisions that if a college student, if the students of a college took part in sedition, in protests against the British government, the entire college could be derecognized. It would not be able to send its students to BA examinations or intermediate examinations, or indeed, or schools, even high school examinations, but schools were not covered by the Indian Universities Act. Secondly, government representatives were appointed to all academic and executive councils of the universities. British officials would sit there. The second provision was so distasteful to academics, who at that time were different from academics today, apparently, that even English professors and in colleges and universities joined the protest. They did not wish to see government officials or nominees sit by their side in their councils. But it was the first power that the government was given of derecognizing institutions that actually provoked the greatest objection. Now, the act was in a sense self-defeating, because particularly in Bengal, where the national movement was very strong among the educated classes, the result was that almost every college held meetings denouncing the Universities Act and actually challenged the government to close it, to derecognize it. And the result was, therefore, that the Universities Act had the adverse effect. Even principals joined in the protest. and academic councils of Calcutta University in particular passed resolutions denouncing these provisions of the Universities Act. And in fact, they could never be put into effect. National agitation could never now be used as a reason to de-recognize any college, because it was known that then every blessed college in Bengal would close. So this was politically a disaster. I said yesterday that Curzon had said that Congress was tottering to its fall and our task is taking it to its grave, but actually that revived the national feeling, strength of the national movement, when among the educated classes at least, when they saw that Curzon's Universities Act could be defied in such a manner. The second was the partition of Bengal. The official reason given out for the partition of Bengal was that Bengal presidency was too large. It then included West Bengal, Bangladesh, Assam, and the other northeastern states, Bihar and Odisha. This was too large for administration, and therefore it should be divided. On the first statement, there could be very few differences. It was on the second point of division, actual division, what will go where, that the main issue came. So while Curzon said that the division was only for administrative purposes, you can see from the papers which are now available that throughout the entire measure, the discussion was how two sections were to be placated: the European tea planters of Assam and the Muslims, landlords and others of Eastern Bengal. In other words, to make it a European versus Indian question and to make it a Muslim versus Hindu question. The tea planters of Assam were not satisfied with the way they were treated from Calcutta, which they thought was dominated by the lower officials and babus of Bengali babus. If the whole capital was shifted to Dhaka, then they would have their savior. And they were proved right immediately. So the line of demarcation did not exactly run along the Bangladesh-Indian frontier of today, but ran along the Muslim-Hindu line of population. The Hindu majority districts were retained in the main presidency of Bengal, which also included Bihar and Orissa, which were Hindu majority areas. Assam was Hindu majority area, but it was dominated by European planters for that, and Eastern Bengal were now joined together with the capital at Dhaka. And the partition was declared in 1905. When the partition was declared, it was naturally opposed by all sections of people of Calcutta, who thought that the courts would shift, even Muslim lawyers in Calcutta would be affected, Muslims finding employment in government employment in Calcutta would be affected. It would now, the offices would shift to Dhaka. So it was a general opposition that first began in Bengal. And if you see in the earlier meetings against partition, Hindus and Muslims both were in the platform. One particularly important Muslim leader was Liaquat Hussain, who remained throughout with the movement against partition. And there were other Abdul Ghaffur and others who were quite prominent in the forums which were formed to oppose partition. And as the partition movement began, then without any reference to the Congress, two important decisions were almost taken by these various meetings. One was the boycott of British goods, particularly British cloth, and the second was Swadeshi, that while boycotting British goods, and of course instead of British goods buying Japanese or German goods, people would try to establish Indian industry. So boycott and Swadeshi became the two important slogans. They were both very strongly supported in Bengal, but they were not followed in other provinces. Particularly Congress, which was in the hands of moderates, confined itself to verbal support of these movements, and its session at Banaras, which the famous Gokhale presided, the moderate leader. Gokhale said that, and this was also in the resolution, that they supported boycott and Swadeshi in Bengal, but not outside, because partition of Bengal was a regional issue, was a provincial issue. In their view, it was not an Indian issue. But owing to the enthusiastic support for the boycott and Swadeshi movement in Bengal, they were compelled to have the next Congress at Calcutta 2006, and to appeal to Dada Bhai Nauroji, who was the most honored leader, to come to Calcutta from England and preside over the next session. Actually, the impact of the Swadeshi slogan was so great that the British government was shaken. And again, I have a verse from Akbar Allahabadi of 1905, in which he says, "Tehreek-e Swadeshi ye mujhe wajd hai Akbar, ke khoob ye nagma hai chada desh ki dhun mein." So even an Urdu poet in Allahabad, true with moderate Congress pretensions, is greatly excited by the slogan of the Swadeshi. And it was also present in the minds of everyone that the partition had not been done only for the benefit of Muslims or Muslim middle classes, but also and mainly in the benefit of the European tea planters. And immediately there was a plan of building the Chittagong Railway, connecting the Assam tea plantations directly with the Bay of Bengal and not through Calcutta. And therefore, a very strong movement was encouraged among Muslims. Now, Muslims were divided clearly. In 1882, when Jamaluddin Afghani was in India, deported from Egypt, he had created his theory of Pan-Islamism. But Pan-Islamism theory was created in order to oppose British imperialism. When he came to Calcutta, he addressed a meeting of young Muslim youth in Calcutta. And he there said that Pan-Islamism doesn't apply to India. If Muslims and Hindus are divided in India, British imperialism will gain, and that is not the objective of Pan-Islamism. Therefore, in India, Hindus and Muslims must unite, and he asked the Muslim youth to join other Indians, particularly Hindu youth, in opposition to the British government. The first result was that Jamaluddin Afghani was also deported from India. These days the Students' Union doesn't pass these bold resolutions, but in 1906 the Students' Union of Mayo College passed a resolution that Hindus and Muslims must unite against the British, despite the partition of Bengal. And this meant that the British government should do something to stop this sentiment. And so the Simla deputation was also prepared. Nationalists long suspected that the English of the Simla deputation, the petition, was clearly showed the draftsmanship of an English official. The fact that Aga Khan headed it, one of the most loyalists of all persons, and today when Aga Foundation is praised and so on, remember that Aligarh Muslim University once received Aga Khan, and there was great applause when he said he would send a check of 2 lakhs, and he gave the check of 2 lakhs to the Vice Chancellor at that time. And there was immense applause. 2 lakhs was a very big sum at that time. The only flaw was that the check bounced. It was a check of 2 lakhs, all right, but it was not honored by the bank. Aga Khan informed the bank not to honor this check. Today he would have gone to jail under the present law, but the university had to keep silent, although they muttered bitterly for a long time. So Aga Khan was head of this delegation. Unfortunately for the integrity of the Simla deputation, an earlier draft of their petition turned up in Sir Harcourt Butler's papers. This was submitted to Butler by an English official. He then made corrections, and this was then sent to Mohsin al-Mulkiyar and Aga Khan, that this would be the petition they were allowed to submit to His Excellency the Viceroy, Lord Minto. Now, the petition argued that since Muslims were the most loyal subjects of the British government in India, thereby throwing doubt on the loyalty of non-Muslims in this country, so they should be favored more than other subjects of the British government. They should get more than their due of population. And since electoral government had been promised, or at least electoral participation had been promised, they demanded separate electorates, larger in number to their proportion in population, and also a more favorable, that is to say in relation to population, share of nominated posts. In other words, an interested offer of loyalty. We are loyal, so we should be rewarded, not a and the Viceroy said that their interests will be protected. Thereafter, this happened in October 1906. In December 1906, the Muslim League, first conference of the Muslim League, was held in Dhaka under Nawab Salimullah Khan, the Nawab of Dhaka, acclaiming the partition of Bengal. But the Aligarh people captured it, where Salimullah Khan was pushed on one side and the Aligarh group captured it. And so Akbar Allahabadi noted again that League has become a league and he had a very poor opinion of us at Aligarh, very poor opinion. Whenever he talked of Aligarh, he talked of आंखें फाड़े दांत निकाले चंदा देकर फंसने वाले etc. At that time, collection of donations was the main business at NU College. Anyway, so within the Muslim League, very rapidly two groups developed, and this often happens when you have the best of schemes that the British government had, but what can you do with people? One group was Mohsin ul-Mulk, Bukhar ul-Mulk and others, and mind you, Mohsin ul-Mulk and Bukhar ul-Mulk were self-given titles. They were not given by any government, they were given by themselves. So they were rapidly pushed to one side, not because of anything notably that was happening in India, although that had its effect. I shall come to those things rapidly, presently. But what was happening outside India in relation to Turkey? British imperial interests demanded that it should have a pie in the Ottoman Empire, and therefore Britain was supporting Greece, Bulgaria, Romania and what later on became Yugoslavia, Serbia, in their rebellions and wars against Turkey. In 1908, the old regime was changed in Turkey and the young Turkish revolution took place. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was also a young Turk. The young Turks were secularists. They rejected the idea that the Caliph was the Khalifa, although they did not actually proclaim it, but they deposed Hamid, who was the Caliph who had been promoting pan-Islamism, and they tried to establish a modern type administration with some popular representation. And therefore young Turks became very popular in India, that their revolution was acclaimed by all sides of nationalists. And the attack on the young Turks, beginning with Italy's invasion of Libya and then the Balkan Wars from 1911, led to all sections of the national movement denouncing the attacks on Turkey and denouncing the British government for supporting them. And an Indian medical mission called the Indian Crescent Medical Mission, led by Dr. M.A. Ansari, who was later to become one of the presidents of the Congress in 1927, he was the leader of it. So this was funded and financed by subscriptions taken from all sections of Indians, and these led to the increasing influence of people like Abul Kalam Azad, Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali, who became and Hasrat Mohani, who became the most prominent people in the Muslim League. Abul Kalam Azad was not in the Muslim League, but through his newspaper Al Hilal, he carried great influence. It was in this situation that the British government wanted to give some concessions to Indian Muslims, and in the Indian Councils Act of 1909, the concessions promised to Shimla deputationists were given. The Muslims could vote with lower qualifications than Hindus. Muslims had some special constituencies where they were direct voters. Hindus had no such constituencies. Then even in the landlords' constituencies, where one representative was to be sent, there was a rotation Muslim and Hindu, very roughly according to the prominence of Muslim landlords. For instance, in UP, where they constituted 1/3 of the landlords, Muslims got half the seats. So this was an obvious attempt to win over Muslim support, and naturally not only the communal section among the Hindus but also many moderates on very good grounds opposed what the Indian Councils Act said. But it must be remembered, one of those who opposed the opponents of the Indian Councils Act was Mahatma Gandhi, who in his Hind Swaraj, written the same year 1909, said that Hindu leaders who are opposing the concessions to Muslims are wrong. If my brother gets more than my share, then I should be happy that he has got it rather than being unhappy. But his was a lone voice. However, I mention it to show how Gandhi was always very strong in these matters. He did not turn to popularity hunting, but stated what he thought was the correct position, and that you will find in Hind Swaraj of 1909. In any case, the ordinary Muslim, of course, did not get anything out of 1909 Act. Neither Muhammad Ali, nor Shaukat Ali, nor Hasrat Mohani, nor Abul Kalam Azad could be elected by Muslim landlords of UP, ever elected by Muslim landlords of UP. So they got nothing. In effect, it was only the loyalist elements among Muslims who could get elected from the Muslim constituencies. And therefore, they remained unsatisfied and hostile to British machinations against Turkey. And for this, they got their due punishment, because in 1911, the partition of Bengal was annulled. British officials had said that partition of Bengal was eternal, and perhaps they were right, because it took place in 47 again. But in 1911, they annulled the partition of Bengal, and immediately all these leaders, nationalist kind of leaders, Azad and Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali, told the loyalists that what have you got for your loyalty? The partition has been annulled, and we always thought that the partition was not done for the good of the Muslims, and now you can see. So the annulment of the partition of Bengal in 1911 further forced a shift in the Muslim League towards a more critical position, taking a more critical position towards the British government, and taking a more accommodative position as far as the Congress was concerned, and ultimately this led, as we will see, to the Congress League Pact of 1940. Now, leaving what can be roughly called Muslim politics aside, I come to the main nationalist politics. In Bengal, the agitation began to peter out in 1906. Naturally, it could not be maintained. It was only confined to Bengal, however intense it might have been. And therefore, this led to two kinds of movements. One on which I will not spend much time was cultural. It will take a long time, it was thought, that Indian people, and particularly people of Bengal, would become conscious of nationalism, and therefore it was best to spend your time more on constructive Swadeshi. Build factories, build schools, build universities. Vishwa Bharati was built then by Rabindranath Tagore. He was one of the leading figures of this cultural movement, and not only the leading figure, but also the person who tried to bring Hindus and Muslims together. In 1911, he wrote that Indian culture was a composite culture. It was not simply a Hindu culture. It was wrong only to go to Upanishads. Muslims and Christians and others had an equal part in it, and this is a very interesting and important essay by Tagore. He also wrote an essay first in this period against equal rights to women, saying that this was not possible, and women, we should not demand equality. Bengali women would have none of it, and he got so much complaints that the next year he withdrew his essay and said, whatever be the situation, whatever be the cultural situation, whatever be what the religion says, men and women are equal, and I was wrong and cowardly in saying that gender equality cannot be established in India. So this was a very important cultural movement in Bengal. Qazi Nazrul Islam was a product of it in Bengali poetry. But in the history of the national movement, the more striking is the violence that now began in Bengal. Violence in the Indian national movement was influenced by two sources outside, Russia in particular, and France. France, where there were organizations of Russian immigrants, and Russia, where violent actions, murder of Russian officials by revolutionaries were taking place. And in 1897, the first political murder of a British official occurred when Rand, the Lake Commissioner, was murdered by Chepekar brothers, who were hanged the next year. So this history of what came to be called revolutionary terrorism begins with this murder at Pune. But there was a man who assumed the name of Aurobindo Ghosh, who began to create a theory of this revolutionary terrorism. Since he was writing openly, it was clothed in hints. But the basic theory was, as I explained yesterday, that the basic principle of Hinduism is not monotheism, it's not ahimsa, it's not a social dharma, it is Shakti, power. And Shakti, it can only be exercised through violence, hinsa. And therefore, although he did not take part in terrorist events, he became its prophet and philosopher. And from 1907, with Khudiram Bose, who attempted to murder a British official, but two English ladies were killed instead, and he mounted the gallows. And songs were then sung in Bengali villages and towns about Khudiram Bose. One of them is meaning that laughingly I have mounted the gallows. It began like that. So Khudiram Bose became a very important figure. And I say this also, I mention its name also because in the objective papers, type papers in competitive examinations, he might get mentioned, because more than Chepekar brothers, he is supposed to be the initiator of revolutionary terrorism. Revolutionary terrorism, although influenced by Aurobindo Ghosh, was not Hindu terrorism, was not Hindu communalism. And when the English encouraged communal rioting in eastern Bengal, in which several Hindu landlords were killed and Hindu shops looted, it was all very one-sided by Muslims. Then these people, these terrorist organizations, decided clearly not to have anything to do with these riots. Their enemy, they said, was the British, not the Muslim rioters. And therefore you will see that they refused to take part in any Muslim killing, or no revenge riots took place in Calcutta. So this is to their credit. Despite the fact that they had this ideal of Hindu nationalism, it was totally directed against the British, and not like the RSS and Hindu Mahasabha directed against Muslims with the British as allies. So there is a major difference between Aurobindo Ghosh's followers. Of course, Aurobindo Ghosh abandoned them. He was tried, defended by the celebrated nationalist lawyer and leader C.R. Das, and then he fled to Pondicherry. But there was a much bigger national movement towards violence, which does not enter our textbooks. I don't know why, except in Sumit Sarkar. The Ghadar movement, Bipin Chandra and Sumit Sarkar, the Ghadar movement. In Punjab, Lala Lajpat Rai and others were regarded as mild extremists. They were Arya Samajists, but compared to Tilak or Bipin Chandra Pal of Bengal, they were very mild in their opposition to the British government. Still, Lala Lajpat Rai was deported because he went to support peasants in the canal colonies. But one man called Ajit Singh, who was the uncle of Shahid Bhagat Singh, he established an association. And if you wanted to establish an association of patriots, what you would call it in Urdu, Ajit Singh picked up the most difficult words that he could find. Anjumane Muhibbane Watan. You know, Muhibbane Watan, lovers of the country. So this was his association. And although he did not believe in terrorism, he certainly believed in semi-violent means. And ultimately, this movement became merged in a much larger and stronger, perhaps the strongest violent movement in the history of the Indian national movement, the Ghadar movement of 1912 to 1914. You can see from the name Ghadar that they drew their inspiration from the rebellion of 1857. In the beginning, there was a strong Sikh support in the Punjab, and there was a strong Sikh, Hindu and Hindu support in the United States, with some Muslims. But Ghadar did not have any religious ideology. They wanted only that India should be free, and therefore they appealed to all Sikhs, Hindus and Muslims. In the Punjab mostly because they were to begin with Punjabis, but remember that the language of education and literacy at that time in the Punjab was Urdu. This movement began in the United States, California and others, where Lala Hardyal went from India. He was a mercurial man. He later on abandoned the other movement and ultimately apologized to the British government. But his later actions do not detract from what he did in America. He provided a nationalist ideology to the Ghadar movement. He was influenced by the left. He was an office holder, official also of San Francisco Trade Union Organization. He knew of Marx and Engels' writings, and therefore he provided in a year a very important left-leaning ideology to the Ghadar movement. Two major events then occurred. One was the episode of the Komagata Maru, that's in the synopsis, a ship, Japanese ship, that Punjabi, mainly Sikh and Muslim peasants chartered for Canada under the laws of Canada and Britain and India. They could not be stopped. They were British subjects, they had British passports, but the ship was turned back from Canada. When they docked in Calcutta, they were protesting against the way they were treated, and these protests were broken up by the police. Some of them died there, and many of them were arrested. And so this incident of 1914 became a signal for the Ghadar movement to begin their violent actions. Many of them returned to India and were executed here for their attempts at citizenship. The largest number of executions of Indians for actions against the British, armed actions against the British, were of the Ghadar workers. Over 50 were executed in 1913-14, about 40 in India and 10 abroad. But I am not counting in it the Ghadar mutineers of Singapore, the so-called Singapore Mutiny of 1915, the first soldiers' mutiny against World War I in the world. The soldiers involved were 5th Light Infantry of the Punjab, entirely Muslim, and some Sikh soldiers also stationed in Singapore. They revolted on the basis of Ghadar propaganda. Your brothers are being executed in India, you must revolt. So they revolted, killed their English officers, and it was a very serious mutiny that was put down with the help of not only British but also Japanese troops. One of their leaders was Chishti Khan. They were practically all Muslims, but they were totally Ghadarites, that is to say, they belonged to the Ghadar movement and were repeating whatever the Ghadar movement is. They were 44 of them were shot. Others sent to life imprisonment of the 5th Light Infantry. And they were shot publicly, but a British official said that this was a mistake because the brave way in which they died had a reverse effect on the audience. So the Singapore Mutiny is a particularly important event in the Indian national movement. Now you come back to India. In India, the war broke out in 1914. The same year, Tilak, who was arrested in 1908 and put on trial, had returned. The Congress, because of the blandishments of the British government towards the moderates, Lord Morley, the Secretary of State, had said in 1906 that we should rally the moderates against the nationalists, the extremists, and they promised reform, which came in the Indian Councils Act of 1907 and 1909, and they therefore now controlled the Congress, while Tilak, whose supporters had been forcibly driven out of the Surat National Congress, session of the National Congress in 1907, he was in prison, but now he came back. So during the time that he was in prison and the moderates had the field, the Indian Councils Act was passed, which most moderates acclaimed as a great success on their part. Although, as you see the provisions of this act, very few moderates were able to be elected even to the Legislative Council because of the very limited electorate, landlord dominated and Muslim dominated electorates under the Indian Council Act. However, they took the annulment of the partition of Bengal as a success. Nevertheless, they had very little to show for their policy of friendship to the British government by 1914 when the war broke out. When the war broke out, everyone formally supported the British against Germany, Austria and Turkey. Even those Muslim and Congress, other leaders, nationalist leaders who had been supporting Turkey, denounced Turkey's decision to go to war on the side of Germany and Austria. As the war proceeded, it did not end immediately. It took 4 years. It was obvious that Indian political life could not wait, and the first thing that was important and for which much credit goes to Tilak was the Congress-League Pact at Lucknow in 1914. In fact, the attempt towards this pact began in 1915 when the Congress and League sessions were held simultaneously at Bombay, and Tilak then proposed that the same thing should be done at Lucknow in 1916, and then there the agreement took place. The agreement amounted simply to this. Other details are minor. Muslim League would accept Swaraj as the object, the independence or the self-rule of the whole country, and the Congress would accept the communal electorates. These were the two major elements. How many seats Muslims will have, they were easily decided. But the basic principles were agreed to. In other words, Muslim League agreed to join the national movement for self-rule. And one of the major Muslim rulers who were from the Congress side was Muhammad Ali Jinnah at the Lucknow. This was called Home Rule. Swaraj was called Home Rule. And soon two Home Rule leagues were built up, one by Tilak and the other by Mrs. Annie Besant, which will promote, because Congress only met once a year. It had no local organizations. Therefore, it was necessary for these two Home Rule leagues to promote the meaning of Home Rule. And one of the major demands of these Home Rule leagues was that the British government should make their war aims clear. Why were they fighting the war? If they were fighting for the national independence of Belgium and Serbia and so on, what about the national independence of India? If not national independence, at least home rule. What about the independence of Turkey? These demands began to be raised, and Mrs. Annie Besant herself was arrested in 1917, which caused great consternation and indignation in India when the British government arrested her for her very strenuous propaganda for home rule and demand that the British government should declare its war aims. The war ended in 1918, and then things began to move fast. But you can't understand these events unless I return and come to Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhiji is important not only because of what he did in India, but what he did in South Africa. He went to South Africa in 1892, and there he lived there for more than 20 years, and there he organized the South African Indian Congress. It might be mentioned, in order to understand Gandhi's positions later, that he went to represent a Muslim businessman's firm. That when he organized the Natal Indian Congress, 90% of the members were Muslims. That until 1914, when he left South Africa, the South African Indian Congress had such a large, not so much a large proportion, but a very large proportion of Muslim members. They were, of course, mostly Gujaratis. But there were people from Tamil Nadu and there were people from Bihar also in South Africa. So Hindi, Urdu and Tamil and Gujarati were the four languages that were spoken by Indians. Gandhi learned to unite all these people. And he also, for the first time, studied European political writers, Ruskin and Tolstoy. From Ruskin he learned how to love work by one's own hands, the dignity of labor, and from Tolstoy he learned the necessity of practicing what you preached, a very important element in Gandhi's character. As far as his political measures were concerned, he learnt much from the Irish nationalists. Civil disobedience, picketing, boycott, these were all Irish methods of peaceful agitation. And if you read Gandhiji's my experiments with truth, you will understand that you will realize that he says as much, that his ideas came from these figures. He does not claim that they came from Bhagavad Gita. In fact, he says New Testament was where he himself drew his ideas from first. And if you read New Testament, you will realize that it's totally text which is totally different from all religious texts, because it only appeals to humanity, it does not appeal to any sectional feeling. So, and we are the salt of the earth and so on for the poor, that particularly made an appeal to Gandhi. So he says all that, and that is important to remember, because then whatever he saw in New Testament and Tolstoy and Ruskin, he then tended to see in Bhagavad Gita and the Quran and the Guru Granth Sahib, although these things are not there, but that is what he did. So he is in effect a modern thinker, although he did not claim to be. As you know, he said that whatever these truths are, they were always there in the religious and moral scriptures of old times. What was important in Gandhi's struggle was that he gradually started what was a movement of the few, the educated, into a movement of the mass. And in his final movement in 1913, which forced Smuts, the Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa, to surrender, involved masses in the real sense. In 1909, Gandhi had said that women should stay at home. In old India, they stayed at home, they should stay at home. 4 years later, he was sending 200 Indian women to prison in Satyagraha. There had been no occasion in India where 200 women had gone to prison for any cause. 200 Indian women go to prison in South Africa. So, within 4 years, he was denying himself. 2000 miners, 75 of them women, marched into Transvaal, leaving their work, leaving their mines, abandoning their mines, so that the mine owners, English, British mine owners, suffered. Nobody, no government in South Africa could handle 2000 prisoners, and they had not enough position for in jails for women prisoners, and therefore Smuts surrendered and agreed to the demands of Mahatma Gandhi. Now, as you will see later, as far as the demands were concerned, they were substantial but not certainly radical. The poll tax on Indians should be removed. The restrictions on Indian businesses should go. Indians should be treated as British subjects of South Africa, at par with other subjects. Apartheid had not come in by that time. So these were agreed to by Smuts, and Gandhi was released not from prison but from some Smuts' own office where the negotiations had taken place. So he then left South Africa, went to England, and finally in 1915 came to India. He joined his mentor Gokhale. Gokhale had been extremely dissatisfied with his book Hind Swaraj. He said the first part was all right, but the second part was horrible. He had used very strong words for it with Gandhi quotes in his own autobiography, and he said that Gandhi should go throughout India and see what the Indian people are like before he begins to proclaim that village India is the ideal place. So Gandhi then travelled throughout India, the famous travels, in a third-class compartment, and it was in 1917 that his political life started with Champaran Satyagraha. Now the Champaran Satyagraha is important because it's really a reflection what he used to do in Africa. Have very moderate demands, but go to almost extreme extent in fighting for them. And for the first time in India, peasants were organized in this manner. They might have been rich peasants against European indigo planters, but they were peasants. They were those who worked with their own hands. And Gandhi said that when I saw peasants in Champaran, I saw God. So that was how he saw the peasantry. And he won and after imprisonment, after much struggle, he won what he wanted. There was an inquiry committee from which the British almost gave whatever Gandhiji was wanting, in effect, in substance, against the decision went against the European indigo planters. And then in 1918, there were the two Ahmedabad workers' strike, where actually he joined and led the striking workers against his own financiers, against the Ahmedabad mill owners. And that there also he had to go on fast because the strike began to peter out. And when he went on his fast, the mill owners finally surrendered and agreed to many of the wage demands. The third satyagraha of this type was the Kheda Satyagraha, a district in Gujarat. Champaran is, of course, in Bihar. A district in Gujarat where the agitation was against British new imposition of taxation under a new settlement. And here also he went totally for very moderate demands, for very moderate reduction. He went to the total extent of civil disobedience locally until the British government moderated the demands. So these were total innovations in India. Nothing like that had happened. Nobody had organized ordinary people for their economic demands, political demands like that. It is only when you understood this that you realized that something new had happened with Gandhi's arrival. Whether without him it would have happened or not, of course, one can always say that it would have happened 3 years later, somebody would have done it, but that is counterfactual history. The facts of history are that the entry of the masses into the national movement begins with Gandhi. You know, whenever he talked of peasants, even when he talked of giving concessions to landlords, the peasants were we and the landlords were they. A very important distinction. The next movement came in 1919, and here again Gandhi was in the forefront. The Congress had nothing to do with it. The Rowlatt Acts. Two Rowlatt bills which were passed by the legislature were in fact totally violative of any kind of civil liberty or free press. Almost anyone could be imprisoned for anything that was just seditious. It was opposed in the Legislative Council. Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Malaviya resigned from the council, and Jinnah then made his famous speech, "I am an Indian first, Indian second, Indian last," in his opposition to the Rowlatt Acts. But these were parliamentary maneuvers. What Gandhi did was a mass movement, the April Satyagraha. And he asked for massive demonstrations against the Rowlatt Acts, demanding not Home Rule, demanding not independence, but simple withdrawal of the Rowlatt Acts. You know what happened then? There was the atrocity at Jallianwala Bagh. The Satyagraha started in April. The Jallianwala Bagh atrocity took place. Even Churchill said in a famous speech, I hope you can find it somewhere, that if the British Empire has to live only if it resorts to firing like Jallianwala Bagh, then it has no justification for living. This is Churchill himself speaking. And of course he was speaking only on the official reports. As far as the nationalist reports, the Jallianwala Bagh inquiry, which Gandhi then organized, in which the other members were Abbas Tayyib ji and I think one more, their report, if you read, then this was barbarous. Only over 700 people were killed in Jallianwala Bagh, men, women and children, at Amritsar. And Gandhi then withdrew his April Satyagraha. He said that I cannot continue the Satyagraha if owing to British actions the cost will be so much. He then even called his April Satyagraha as a Himalayan blunder. In any case, despite the withdrawal, the movement for rectification of Punjab wrongs, as it was called, was continued. And not only was the report published by the Congress, but the next session of the Congress was held at Amritsar in 1919, December 1919. Now, the Amritsar Congress seemed to be a triumph of moderation, except that Gandhi was quietly preparing a constitution for the Congress, which would mean that every branch of the Congress would be an active association throughout the year. Its district committees, its provincial committees, organized on language basis. So Amritsar Congress is important from the point of view of its organization. It practically accepted Gandhi's leadership because he was the man who had, within 2 years or 3 years, enthused the whole of India. These were there, but this Congress did not even call for non-cooperation with the 1919 Act, which had given very little to Indians, not even provincial autonomy. Everything would be controlled by the British government. There would be what was called diarchy in the provinces, but that division of powers was also only nominal. So there was a great dissatisfaction with the Government of India Act of 1919, but the Congress did not decide even to non-cooperate with the elections. But what changed the situation was the position in Turkey. Why you would say that Indian nationalists were so concerned with Turkey? They were not concerned with Germany, they were not so concerned with China, they were concerned with Turkey. Because they saw that there were only 2 independent countries left in Asia, Turkey and Japan. All others were under, outside Soviet Russia, Soviet Union, under British, French, American influences. And if Turkey lost its independence, British imperialism would be supreme. And this affected all people in India, whether those who recognized the Khalifa, Turkish Sultan as Khalifa or not. The other reason why Turkey became important was this business of Khalifa. Actually, Muslims had not paid much attention to the Turkish Sultan as Khalifa. Mughal emperors had called themselves Khalifatul Zaman, but nobody recognized them as Khalifa. They did not recognize the Turkish Sultan as Khalifa. Tipu Sultan did not call him Khalifa. He called him by a very secondary name, Khundkar, even in their diplomatic correspondence. But the British had been actually promoting the idea of the Turkish Sultan as Khalifa so long as the Ottomans were in alliance with Britain up till 1890s. And so they had even asked Sir Syed Ahmad Khan to go to Afghanistan to plead with the Afghans that they should recognize Ottoman Emperor as their Khalifa and they would see the British as allies of the Khalifa. But that didn't come off. In any case, now everyone, Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali, although they were on record saying that the Sharif of Makkah was the leader of should be the leader of the Muslims, but now they were claiming that by defeating the Khalifa, by subordinating the Khalifa to their interests, the whole of Islam has been humiliated by Britain and France, and therefore Khilafat was a religious issue. There were thus 2 elements in the national upsurge on the matter of Turkey, whether you were fighting for Turkish independence or whether you were fighting for the Khalifa, and the 2 joined because Kemal Ataturk, who was then leading a rebel army in Asia Minor, Anatolia, also said although he was himself against the Khalifa, he was a modernist, he would not allow Muslim religion even to be practiced openly. But he was saying that the British and French were insulting Islam because of what they were doing, their subordination of Khalifa. And Indians would say Khalifa would become another Nizam of Hyderabad. So these two streams joined. And nationalists got two other points of agitation. The Punjab wrongs, nobody had been punished for what had been done in the Punjab, in Amritsar and others, and nobody had been, and the Indian Councils Act was utterly toothless and nothing had been gained there. So these were the three issues on which the movement was to begin, but Khilafat came first. And in the Khilafat movement, of which Gandhi was invited as a member, it was Gandhi who proposed non-cooperation. The other Khilafat leaders were very nervous, but Gandhi assured them that he would get the Congress to support it. And in the provisional session of the Congress at Calcutta, actually the support was extremely, the Congress was very divided, but in the Nagpur Congress in December 1920, C.R. Das, in one of those dramatic changes of position, when he went to sleep, he was against non-cooperation. He had brought a whole body of delegates committed to opposition to non-cooperation. When he woke up, he was for cooperation, non-cooperation. I don't know what happened in the night, but he came and announced that he was all for non-cooperation, and all his followers suddenly turned turtle, so to speak, and they were also for non-cooperation and ready to go to prison. But one could say for the courage of these people, sheer courage, that they knew what was coming and yet they would support non-cooperation. So Congress adopted non-cooperation on three slogans, of which Home Rule was not a part: Punjab wrongs, the inadequacy of the Act of 1919, and above all, Khilafat and independence of Turkey. The movement was so successful that in October 1921, non-cooperation was extended to the army. No Indian should join the army. And it had previously been said that if Indian troops were sent to Turkey, then the non-cooperation would be extended to every branch, not just educational institutions and law courts. And so the Indian Viceroy in India had then wired to the Secretary of State for India that Britain should consider whether, if they use the Indian army, whether they would like to lose India and simply gain Turkey. They should look at the sizes of the two countries. This was the situation. So the English were unable to intervene in Turkey because they were not able to send British troops. The British troops had fought for 4 years. They were totally tired. Nobody was prepared then to go to war in Turkey, and they could not use Indian troops because the Viceroy from India said that they wouldn't go there and you would have on hand a series of mutinies which would totally shake India. So if this was the situation, then obviously only Greek army could operate in Turkey, and that army the Turks defeated. Then the Soviet Red Army had reached the borders of Turkey, and Kemal Ataturk had said that he would invite the Red Army if any allied army tried to enter Turkey. But one of the major factors still in saving Turkish independence, which Turks don't recognize, of course, they only go on asking about what happened to the 2 crores Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali collected for Turkey. but which disappeared in the hands of several people in Bombay. You see, this is the, if you compare Muslim organizations with, I should not say it, but with a Hindu organization, Gandhi collected 2 crores in Tilak Fund, and every pice was accounted to for, and Jamia Millia Islamia was for 15 years maintained out of Tilak Fund, and also some other nationalist institutions. Whereas Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali collected this, they kept no accounts, and according to their own statement, 45 lakhs of rupees were simply embezzled by two Bombay bankers, both Orthodox Muslims, but they loved money, they loved Lakshmi, so they had 45 lakhs, and nobody knows what happened to the rest. Shaukat Ali and Muhammad Ali were clean, but the others were not so clean. So Turks have always made an issue of what happened to the 2 crores which were collected for Kemal Ataturk and his army, and where they had disappeared. Anyway, this was one of the things that troubled the Ali brothers and darkened their last days. As far as the other, but ultimately, before the Allies made peace with Ataturk, the movement here in India had been withdrawn for other reasons than the success of Kemal Ataturk. Major reason was that violence had now begun taking place. The Congress had not raised the issue of home rule or Swaraj as an aim until the Ahmedabad Congress of December 1921. But even before that, peasants had launched an upsurge in different areas, mainly against landowners and against rent payment. In Kerala, there was also, this had a communal character also when the Mapla rising took place in 1921. But Gandhi did not make that an issue for withdrawing the